Time does not heal all wounds. It simply teaches us how to live with the scars. But sometimes those scars shape the very hands that will one day deliver justice. It's a quiet truth, one that brews in the silence of long nights and lonely dawns. A truth Alara would come to understand not as a victim, but as a witness. Her story begins not with a thunderous declaration of war, but with the soft, almost silent closing of a heavy door, on a day when the sky itself seemed to be weeping for what was lost. The city was Boston. The season was a damp, gray autumn that clung to the bones. Rain fell in relentless sheets against the panoramic windows of the Sterling mansion, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass. Inside, the air was still and cold, smelling of old money and unspoken resentments. Alara stood in the center of the vast living room, her hand resting instinctively on the gentle swell of her belly, a 5-month curve that held all of her hopes. She was 24, and she believed until this very moment that she was living a fairy tale. Across from her stood Liam, her husband, the prince of this cold castle. But the man she saw now was a stranger, his handsome face a mask of detached resolve. He spoke, and his voice, usually so warm, was as sterile as the marble floor beneath her feet. "I can't do this, Alara." He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed somewhere over her shoulder on the rain-streaked skyline. "A child, right now. It's a complication my family's legacy cannot afford." The words were practiced, rehearsed. They were not his own. They belonged to his mother, to the dynasty he served. Alara felt the air leave her lungs, a silent gasp that made her dizzy. His family's legacy. The baby, their baby, was just a complication. She could feel the tiny, fluttering life within her, a secret conversation of love that this man would never hear. Her own voice was a whisper she barely recognized. "Liam, what are you saying?" But she knew. She had known for weeks, in the way he avoided her touch, in the chillingly polite dinners with his mother, in the sudden, frequent business trips with a woman whose name tasted like poison on her tongue. Liam finally met her eyes, and in them, she saw no conflict, no sadness, only a chilling finality. He stepped forward, not to comfort her, but to place a golden key and a platinum credit card on the mahogany table between them. An offering, a severance package. "My father has arranged for a generous settlement," he said, his voice flat. "It will be more than enough for you to start over, somewhere else." And with that, he turned. He walked away from her, from the life they had built, from the child he had helped create. Alara didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply stood, frozen, as the sound of his footsteps faded on the marble. The heavy front door opened, letting in a gust of damp, cold air, and then it closed with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, sealing her fate. She was alone. Utterly, completely alone, with nothing but the sound of the rain, the frantic beating of her own broken heart, and a tiny, precious complication that was now her only reason to survive. Before the rain-streaked windows and the deafening silence of a closed door, there was a time of intoxicating sunlight and whispered promises. Their story, like all the most convincing tragedies, began as a romance. Alara first met Liam, not in a boardroom or at a charity gala, but in a small, independent art gallery where her paintings were on display. She was an artist, a woman who saw the world in vibrant hues and textured layers, whose hands were more comfortable with charcoal and clay than with crystal champagne flutes. He was a spectator who seemed, for a moment, to have stepped out of a different world. He wasn't just handsome. He was illuminated by the glow of inherited confidence, the easy charm of a man who had never been told no. He said her work had soul, that she captured emotion in a way he'd never seen before. He bought her largest canvas, but it was her heart he truly wanted. Alara, whose life had been a comfortable landscape of middle-class realities, was swept into his orbit. She came from a home filled with warmth and laughter, where wealth was measured in shared meals and unwavering support. Liam's world was different. It was a world of towering glass buildings, of hushed conversations in paneled rooms, of a name Sterling that was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear throughout Boston's financial district. She fell in love not with the name, but with the man she believed existed beneath it. The Liam who would sneak away from society events to walk with her along the Charles River, his arm a secure weight around her shoulders. The Liam whose eyes would soften when she spoke of her dreams, who seemed to crave the genuine, uncomplicated world she came from. She believed his love was a bridge between their two worlds, strong enough to bear any weight. But a bridge needs an anchor on both sides, and Liam's anchor was not his own. It was, and always had been, his mother, Beatrice Sterling. Beatrice was the matriarch of the Sterling Empire, a woman forged in the crucible of old money and ruthless ambition. She was perpetually elegant, her posture perfect, her silver hair styled into a flawless chignon. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering, a polite, thin curve that never once reached her cold, calculating eyes. From the moment Liam introduced Elara, Beatrice saw her not as a daughter-in-law, but as a strategic miscalculation. In Beatrice's meticulously curated world, love was a currency, and marriage was a merger. Elara, with her artistic spirit and her humble origins, was a foreign currency, worthless in the sterling exchange. The first year of their marriage was a masterclass in psychological warfare, conducted with impeccable manners. The Sterling mansion, a place Elara had hoped to fill with life and color, remained a pristine, cold museum. When Elara tried to hang one of her own vibrant, abstract paintings in the hallway, she found it replaced the next day by a somber, ancestral portrait. "The light in this hall is much better suited for oil, my dear," Beatrice had explained, her tone dripping with false helpfulness. When Elara hosted her first dinner party for their friends, Beatrice rearranged the seating chart at the last minute, ensuring Elara was seated far from Liam, isolated among Beatrice's own stony-faced confidants. The insults were never direct, always veiled in the silken fabric of high society etiquette. "That dress is lovely, Elara," Beatrice would say, her eyes sweeping over her. "It's so brave to be bold with color." Every word was a tiny, poisoned dart, designed to remind Elara that she was an outsider, an imposter in their gilded cage. Liam, caught between the woman he loved and the mother he feared, became a ghost in his own home. In the privacy of their bedroom, he would apologize. "She's just from a different generation, Elara. She means well." He would hold her and promise to stand up to his mother, to carve out a space for them that was truly their own. But these promises would evaporate in the morning light. At the breakfast table, under Beatrice's cool gaze, Liam would shrink. A weekend trip he had promised Elara would be swiftly canceled when Beatrice announced a sudden, unavoidable business brunch. His opinions would shift to mirror his mother's after just a few minutes of quiet conversation with her in the study. Elara watched the man she loved recede, replaced by the Sterling heir, a puppet whose strings were pulled by a practiced, unyielding hand. The loneliness was an entity of its own, a silent guest at their dinner table. The mansion was filled with staff, but Elara had never felt more alone. The parties they hosted were not celebrations. They were performances. Elara learned to play her part, to smile, to wear the exquisite jewels Liam bought her, as if they were not the glittering emblems of her captivity. She would stand in a room full of people, a glass of champagne in her hand, and feel utterly invisible. She was an accessory, a beautiful object Liam had acquired, and now one that his mother was patiently teaching him to discard. She realized with a sickening certainty that Beatrice was not just trying to control her, she was trying to erase her, to methodically sand away at Liam's affection until nothing was left but duty to the Sterling name. And she was succeeding. The late-night talks disappeared, replaced by the silence of Liam working on his laptop in bed. The spontaneous walks by the river were replaced by scheduled appearances at fundraisers. The man who had been captivated by her soul was now consumed by the soulless pursuit of maintaining his family's legacy. The fairy tale had rotted from the inside out, leaving only a hollow, beautiful shell. Elara was no longer a wife. She was an occupant, living in a house that would never be her home, with a man who was no longer her partner. It was in the sterile silence of a marble bathroom, with the morning light streaming in, that Elara discovered the secret she had been carrying. A fragile, hopeful secret that felt like the first warm day of spring after a long, bitter winter: pregnancy. The word itself was a revolution. In the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the Sterling mansion, where every move was scrutinized and every choice was judged, this felt like an act of pure, unassailable creation. It was a life that belonged to her and Liam, a truth that no amount of wealth or influence could alter. She held the knowledge close to her heart for a week, a private, joyful flame warming her from the inside out. This child, she believed, would be the key. It would melt the frost in Beatrice's heart and remind Liam of the love that had brought them together. A baby was not a complication. It was a foundation, a reason to build a true family, to finally become a we that was stronger than the Sterling name. She chose to tell them at dinner. The dining room was Beatrice's throne room, a place of hushed formality with a long, polished table that felt more like a barrier than a gathering place. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for the main course to be cleared. Liam sat opposite her, looking tired, his mind clearly on business. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, a silent, regal judge. "Liam, Beatrice," Ilara began, her voice trembling slightly. "I have some wonderful news. We have some wonderful news." She looked at Liam, her eyes pleading for him to share this moment with her. "I'm pregnant." For a single, fleeting second, she saw it. A flicker of genuine joy in Liam's eyes, a ghost of the man she had fallen in love with. His mouth curved into an instinctive smile. But then, as always, his gaze slid to his mother, and the smile died. Beatrice did not gasp. She did not smile. She simply placed her silver fork down beside her plate with a quiet, deliberate click that echoed in the vast room. The silence that followed was immense, a heavy blanket that smothered all the joy from the air. Ilara felt her own smile falter, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. When Beatrice finally spoke, her voice was unnervingly calm, devoid of any warmth. "A child," she stated, as if discussing a line item on a budget. "How?" Unexpected. Her eyes, cold and sharp as splinters of glass, were fixed on her son. "Liam, I trust you've considered the implications of this. The timing is far from ideal." The message was clear. This was not a celebration. This was a problem to be managed. Liam, deflated, could only murmur, "Of course, Mother. We've discussed it." They hadn't, not really, but in that moment, he had already switched his allegiance. Ilara was alone again, her wonderful news turning to ash in her mouth. That night marked the beginning of Beatrice's campaign. It was a subtle, insidious war waged, not with raised voices, but with quiet conversations behind closed doors, with planted seeds of doubt that took root in the fertile ground of Liam's weakness. Ilara would hear the low murmur of their voices from the study, Beatrice's tone one of feigned, maternal concern. She was an artist of manipulation, and Liam was her most pliable clay. "I worry for your future, darling," she would tell him, her hand on his arm. "You are on the cusp of the biggest expansion in Sterling history. A crying baby, a distracted wife. These things can derail a man. An empire is not built on sentiment." She framed Ilara's pregnancy not as a shared joy, but as a unilateral, selfish act. "A woman in her position has a lot to gain from securing an heir," she would muse, letting the poison sink in. "It ensures her place, doesn't it?" A very clever strategy. Then, Beatrice introduced her queen into the game. Her name was Serafina Vance. She was the daughter of Harrison Vance, the head of a rival real estate conglomerate that Beatrice had been trying to merge with for years. Serafina was everything Ilara was not. She was cool, impeccably tailored, and spoke the language of acquisitions and hostile takeovers as fluently as Ilara spoke of color theory. She was, in Beatrice's eyes, the perfect woman, a strategic asset. Serafina began to appear everywhere. At charity galas, Beatrice would steer Liam directly to her, praising her recent business successes loud enough for everyone to hear. "Serafina just secured the waterfront development project," she'd announce. "Such a brilliant, focused mind. She understands what it takes to build a legacy." The unspoken contrast hung in the air, unlike your artistic, emotional wife. Business dinners for three became a regular occurrence. Alara would be invited, of course to maintain appearances, but she was made to feel like a third wheel, a silent, decorative object. Liam, Serafina, and Beatrice would discuss market trends and zoning laws, their conversation a dense, impenetrable wall. Liam, energized by Serafina's sharp intellect and his mother's obvious approval, would light up in a way Alara hadn't seen in years. He was performing for them, proving that he was a true sterling, unburdened by domestic sentiment. Serafina, for her part, played her role perfectly, treating Alara with a kind of dismissive pity that was more insulting than outright cruelty. The merger with Vance Industries was no longer just a business proposition. Beatrice began to speak of it as a destiny, a joining of two great houses. A union between Liam and Serafina was the unspoken, yet obvious, final step. Alara felt the ground crumbling beneath her. The man who slept beside her each night was becoming a stranger, his conversations clipped and distant, his apologies for his absences more frequent and less sincere. He started parroting Beatrice's words. "It's just a stressful time at work, Ilara. Serafina is a vital business partner. My mother is only thinking of the family's future." The child inside her was growing, a constant, physical reminder of the life she was fighting for, but she was losing the battle. The beautiful bridge of love she thought she had built was cracking under the immense, calculated pressure of the Sterling legacy. One evening, as she lay in bed alone, waiting for Liam to come home from another late meeting, she felt it for the first time, a tiny, definitive flutter from within. A kick. She placed both hands on her belly, tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of profound, fierce love. This tiny life was real. It was hers. And in that moment, she knew with a terrifying certainty that this child was not a bridge to save her marriage. It was a lifeboat for her and her alone. The ship was already sinking. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into a new kind of silence. It was a silence that filled the spaces between words, that clung to the furniture and chilled the air. Liam was a phantom in their home, a man made of shadows and excuses. The empty space on his side of the bed grew colder. His clothes began to disappear from the closet, subtly at first, a suit here, a few shirts there, as if he were slowly erasing his own existence from her life. The flimsy excuses of late meetings and business dinners grew bolder, now openly including Serafina's name. "The Vances are hosting a reception," he'd state, not as an invitation, but as a declaration of his itinerary. He was no longer hiding his new life. He was simply living it, and Alara was merely a resident in the house where he used to sleep. She was living with the ghost of her husband, while the real man was building a new future elsewhere. The house, once a symbol of a dream, became a labyrinth of painful memories. Every room held an echo of a promise he had made and broken. Alara found herself retreating, spending most of her time in her small art studio, the one room in the house that felt like hers. There, surrounded by the scent of turpentine and oil paints, she would talk to the growing life inside her, a one-sided conversation that was the only honest one she had anymore. The baby's kicks became stronger, more insistent, a secret rhythm that only she could feel, a tiny drumbeat of hope in a world that had gone quiet and cold. She was becoming a mother in the ruins of her marriage, a fierce, protective love forging itself in the crucible of neglect. The final, fatal blow came not from a confrontation, but from a whisper in the dark. It was late, past midnight, and the house was submerged in shadow. Alara was walking past the library, its heavy oak doors left slightly ajar, when she heard their voices, Liam and Beatrice. Her heart seized. She pressed herself against the cold wall in the hallway, hidden in the darkness, and listened. Liam's voice was thin, laced with a familiar weakness. "Mother, are you certain this is the only way?" "A settlement. It feels so." "Clinical." A dry, rustling sound followed, the sound of Beatrice's dismissive laugh. "Clinical? Liam, it is precise. It is necessary. Sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford, and love is a currency that has no value on the open market. This is business." Then Beatrice's voice dropped, becoming as sharp and as hard as a diamond. "She is a nobody, Liam. Her background is a liability. Her child, and she said the word with a chilling disdain, will dilute the Sterling bloodline and entitle her to a piece of everything your grandfather built. It is a parasite on our legacy. Ilara felt the words like a physical strike. A parasite, her baby. A wave of nausea washed over her, so intense she had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Beatrice wasn't finished. The Vance merger depends on your complete availability, on a clean slate. Serafina is a partner. Ilara is a mistake. You will correct this mistake, Liam. End it. End it before this becomes a public spectacle. Give her the money, and she will disappear. People like her always do. There was a pause, and then Liam's voice, small and defeated. Yes, Mother. The world tilted. The ornate wallpaper of the hallway seemed to warp and twist around her. This wasn't a breakup. This was an extermination. A corporate downsizing of a human life. She was a bad investment being written off. Their child was collateral damage. She stumbled back to her room, her body numb, her mind a screaming void. She did not sleep. She watched the dawn break, painting the gray sky with shades of bruised purple and desolate orange, and she waited. He came for her the next afternoon as the sky opened up and a cold, relentless rain began to fall. He entered the living room where she was waiting, his expression carefully neutral. He was wearing a suit she had never seen before, tailored and severe. He was already dressed for his new life. He did not ask how she was. He did not acknowledge the child that was visibly growing between them. He simply began to speak his rehearsed lines, the ones his mother had fed him. Ilara, this isn't working, he began, his voice flat. My responsibilities to the company, to my family's legacy, they require my full attention. A child, right now, is a complication I cannot afford. He said the words she had overheard, and hearing them directed at her face was a new kind of violation. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. All the fight had been drained from her by the poison she had absorbed the night before. She simply looked at him, at this stranger wearing her husband's face, and asked a single quiet question. Was any of it real? For a moment, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or a memory of the truth crossed his face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a flicker of annoyance, of impatience. He was on a schedule. This was the last item on his agenda. He needed it to be over. Without answering her question, he stepped to the mahogany table. He placed the golden key and the platinum credit card upon its polished surface. The final transaction, a key for a life, a credit card for a child. My father's lawyers will be in touch, he said, his voice all business. The settlement is generous. You will be comfortable. And then he turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps was loud in the silent room. The heavy front door opened, and then it closed. The click of the latch echoed, a final, metallic punctuation mark on the end of her life as she knew it. The rain beat against the glass, and Ilara stood alone, a queen deposed in a cold, empty castle, with nothing left but the ruins of her heart and the unborn heir to a kingdom of ashes. For a full day, Ilara did not move. She remained in the silent living room as the rain gave way to a cold, clear dusk, and then to the deep, impenetrable black of night. She didn't cry. The pain was too vast, too structural, for tears. It was a shattering of the very foundation of her reality. But as the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the windows, something shifted inside her. It was a quiet, cold fury, a survival instinct that had been dormant and was now awakened by the tiny life that depended on her. She was not just Ilara anymore. She was a mother. And a mother does not break. She endures. She fights. With a newfound, chilling clarity, she walked upstairs. She ignored the vast walk-in closet filled with designer clothes and expensive gifts, the wages of her gilded captivity. Instead, she pulled out a single, worn duffel bag, the one she had brought with her from her parents' home all those years ago. Into it, she packed her old jeans, a few worn sweaters, and her box of art supplies. She took nothing that had the Sterling name attached to it, nothing that had been bought with their cold, transactional money. As she was about to leave the room, her eyes fell upon a small, framed photo on her bedside table. It was a picture of her and Liam from before the wedding, on a trip to a windswept cliff in Maine. They were laughing, genuinely happy, their faces illuminated by a love she had believed was real. With a steady hand, she removed the photo, tore it neatly in half, and let Liam's smiling face flutter into the wastebasket. She kept the other half, the one of a hopeful, smiling girl she barely recognized, and tucked it deep into her bag. A courier arrived that morning with a thick envelope containing the settlement agreement, a document detailing the seven-figure sum that was meant to buy her silence and erase her existence. She left it, unopened, on the polished mahogany table, right beside the golden key and the platinum credit card. She would not be bought. She would not be paid for her pain. She walked out of the mansion with her single bag, closing the heavy door behind her without a second glance. She did not take a cab to the airport. She walked to the nearest bus station, her face obscured by a simple scarf, and bought a one-way ticket to a place she had only ever seen in magazines, the coast of Oregon. A place as far away from the stifling, incestuous world of Boston high society as she could get. A place where the sterling name was just a word, and where the ocean was vast enough to swallow any secret. The journey was a long, rattling blur of nameless towns and changing landscapes. With every mile that passed, she felt the suffocating weight of her old life begin to lift. She arrived in the small coastal town of Seacliff with less than $1,000 to her name. Her belly now, a proud, unignorable curve beneath her sweater. The air smelled of salt and pine and damp earth. A clean, honest scent that was the very antithesis of the cloying perfumes of the Sterling mansion. She found a small, furnished apartment for rent above a quiet bookstore, with a window that looked out over the churning gray expanse of the Pacific. It was old and the floors creaked, but it was safe. It was hers. Within a week, she found a job waitressing at a local cafe, the Salty Mug. The owner, a kind, no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Clara, looked at Alara's swollen belly, then at the quiet dignity in her eyes, and simply said, "You can start tomorrow. Don't lift anything heavy." For the first time in years, Ilara was surrounded not by judgment, but by a quiet, unspoken compassion. The final months of her pregnancy passed in a simple, rhythmic routine. The early morning chill on her walk to work, the warmth of the cafe, the tired climb up the stairs to her small apartment at the end of the day. She was often lonely, but she was never alone. She spoke to her son constantly, her hand resting on her belly, telling him about the sound of the sea and the shapes of the clouds. She was building a world for him with her words, a world of peace and strength, before he even entered it. The night he came was wild and stormy. The wind howled outside her window, and the waves crashed against the shore with a primal fury. She went through labor in the small, quiet local hospital, her only companion the steady, rhythmic beeping of a machine beside her bed. There were moments of fear, of pain so immense she thought it would tear her apart. In those moments, she did not think of Liam with longing, but with a white-hot anger that became her fuel. This pain was her battle, her victory. She would not be a tragic figure in his story. She would be the hero of her own. And then, after an eternity of struggle, she heard it. A cry. A powerful, life-affirming scream that cut through the sound of the storm. The nurse laid him in her arms. He was small, perfect, his face red and crumpled, his tiny fists clenched. Ilara looked at him, and the entire world, with all its pain and betrayal and loss, simply fell away. All that was left was this new miraculous soul. His eyes, when he opened them, were a deep, clear blue. Her own eyes reflected back at her. There was no trace of the Sterlings in his face, no echo of their coldness. He was entirely new, entirely hers. Tears finally came, not of sadness, but of a love so overwhelming it felt like it was physically remaking her heart. "Julian," she whispered, a name she had chosen for its gentleness. In the quiet of the hospital room, with the storm still raging outside, she made a silent vow to the tiny, sleeping child in her arms. She would not raise him in the shadow of his father's betrayal. She would not fill him with bitterness or anger. She would raise him in the light of her love. She would build him a spine of steel, so he would never be broken, and a heart of compassion, so he would never break others. The pain Liam had caused was not the end of her story. It was the fire that had forged her into the mother Julian needed her to be. Her strength was no longer just her own. It now belonged to him. 10 years is a lifetime. Or, more accurately, it is enough time to build a new one, brick by brick, day by day, on the foundations of what was broken. The Alara of Boston, the timid, heartbroken girl left standing in the rain, was a ghost, a faded photograph tucked away in a drawer. The woman who now stood in the warm, flower-dusted light of her own bakery in Seacliff, Oregon, was someone new. She was a business owner. She was a pillar of her small community. Most importantly, she was Julian's mother. Her journey had been slow and arduous. The meager savings and waitress tips had been painstakingly gathered, not for luxuries, but for survival. She began by selling small paintings of the Oregon coast to tourists, her art once again becoming her voice. Then, she started baking from the tiny oven in her apartment, the recipes a comforting legacy from her own mother. Her sourdough bread, with its tangy crust and soft, airy crumb, became a local legend. First, she sold loaves to her neighbors, then to the local grocer. Finally, after years of saving every spare dollar, she took a leap of faith and leased a small, neglected storefront on Main Street. She painted the walls a warm, sunny yellow, hung her own art, and named it the Rising Loaf. The name was a promise to herself, and she had kept it. The bakery was now the heart of the town, a place that smelled of hope, cinnamon, and freshly ground coffee, always filled with the gentle murmur of conversation from her loyal customers. Her life with Julian was the masterpiece she was most proud of. Their small rented house was filled not with expensive artifacts, but with books, half-finished art projects, and the constant, happy clutter of a 10-year-old boy's life. Julian was a bright, joyful child, with his mother's kind eyes and a quick, inquisitive mind that missed nothing. He was the center of her universe, and she was the sun in his. Their evenings were spent doing homework at a large wooden table in the back of the bakery, or walking along the beach as the sun set, their footprints trailing behind them in the wet sand. He knew he didn't have a father in the traditional sense, but he never felt a lack. His mother's love was a force of nature, vast and unconditional, more than enough to fill any empty space. He was a happy, secure child, fiercely proud of the strong, capable woman who was his entire world. The past was a different country, a place Alara rarely visited. But sometimes an echo from that distant land would find its way across the years. It happened on a Tuesday, during a routine trip to the grocery store. As she waited in the checkout line, her eyes drifted to the magazine rack. And there they were, staring out from the glossy cover of a national business journal, Liam and Serafina Sterling. The headline was bold, aggressive. The Sterling power couple, dominance, dynasty, and the deal of the decade. Alara felt a strange, cold jolt, as if she'd touched a live wire. It wasn't pain, not anymore. It was the shock of seeing a ghost in broad daylight. Liam looked older. The boyish charm she had once loved was gone, replaced by a hard, polished veneer. There were lines of stress around his eyes that even the professional airbrushing couldn't completely erase. Serafina stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her smile a thin, sharp line. They were a perfect, formidable pair, radiating wealth and power. They looked less like a married couple and more like two CEOs who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover. Against her better judgment, Alara bought the magazine. That night, long after Julian was asleep, she sat in her quiet living room with a cup of tea and opened the pages. The article was a breathless ode to their success. It detailed the aggressive expansion of Sterling Corp after the merger with Vance Industries, listing their acquisitions, their luxury properties in Dubai and London, their lavish fundraising galas. It was a portrait of an empire. But as Alara read between the lines, she saw the cracks in the facade. The journalist used words like high risk, leveraged, and ruthless. A quote from an unnamed competitor described Liam's business style as a desperate gamble for legacy. The smiles in the accompanying photos were brittle, their body language stiff and posed. They were performing success, and the strain was visible just beneath the surface. Alara looked at the photo of the man she had once promised to love forever. She felt no flicker of longing, no pang of regret. The man on the page was a stranger, a hollow man in a tailored suit, his soul traded for a stock portfolio. She felt a profound and unexpected wave of pity. Pity for his empty eyes, for his loveless, strategic marriage, for the gilded prison he had chosen for himself. He had inherited an empire, and it had consumed him. She had been left with nothing, and from that nothing, she had built everything that mattered. She closed the magazine and looked around her small, cozy home. She could hear the soft sound of Julian breathing in the next room. She thought of the simple, genuine pleasure of a customer biting into a warm croissant she had made with her own hands. She thought of Julian's laughter as they chased the waves on the beach. Her life was measured in small, real moments of joy, not in market shares or public offerings. The echo from her past life had reached her, but it was faint and thin, a whisper from a world that no longer held any power. She had not just survived the fall from the Sterling Tower. She had discovered that true life was on the ground, with her hands in the earth, building something real and lasting. She got up, slid the magazine into the recycling bin, and went to check on her son, the quiet, immense fortune that could never be bought or sold. Another 5 years passed, as quickly and as quietly as the coastal fog rolling in and out of Seacliff. The boy who had helped his mother sweep flour from the bakery floor was now a young man. At 15, Julian was tall and lean, with the same thoughtful blue eyes as his mother, but with a quiet intensity that was entirely his own. The world of childhood, with its simple joys and clear boundaries, had receded, replaced by the complex, shifting landscape of adolescence. He was no longer just a son. He had become Alara's partner in their small, shared life. His brilliance, which had always been a quiet hum beneath the surface, now found its voice in the language of code and circuits. He built a streamlined inventory system for the rising loaf on a cheap, refurbished laptop, designed a simple but elegant website that brought in tourists and could diagnose and fix any technical problem with an unnerving, focused calm. He had always been observant. He saw the way his mother would sometimes pause while kneading dough, her eyes looking out the window at something far away, a fleeting shadow of a memory crossing her face before she blinked it away. He saw how, on holidays, when other families gathered in large, boisterous clans, it was always just the two of them, a small but fiercely loyal unit. He knew there was a story, a wound that had healed into a scar she never spoke of. He had respected her silence, understanding instinctively that some doors are kept closed for a reason. He had been content with the simple, edited version of his past. His father was a man from a different life, one that had not been right for them. But the questions of a child are different from the questions of a young man who is beginning to understand the world and his own place in it. The catalyst was, as it often is, mundane. A history class project, requiring each student to build a detailed family tree, complete with stories and interviews from parents and grandparents. Julian stared at the template, at the sprawling branches on his mother's side, which she had helped him fill with stories of love and laughter, and then at the stark, empty branch on his father's side. It was a void, a question mark that stared back at him from the page. That evening, after the last customer had left and the smell of cooling bread filled the air, he found his mother in the back, sketching in her notebook. He didn't storm in with accusations or angry demands. He simply sat down across from her, placed the assignment on the table, and said, his voice steady, "Mom, I need to know the real story, not the one for a kid. I'm not a kid anymore." Alara looked at her son's face, at the determined set of his jaw, and knew this moment was inevitable. The time for gentle fables was over. She took a deep breath, the flour-dusted air seeming to steady her, and she began to speak. She did not weave a tale of villains and victims. She told him the truth, with a quiet dignity that honored the complexity of the past. She started with the art gallery, with the intoxicating feeling of being young and in love, so he would understand that he was born from love, not from a mistake. She described the Sterling mansion, not as a castle, but as a beautiful, cold museum, and she spoke of Beatrice not as a monster, but as a woman so consumed by the preservation of her empire that she saw human beings as assets or liabilities. When she spoke of Liam, her voice was even devoid of the bitterness that had long since dissolved. "Your father, he wasn't a bad man, Julian. Not in his heart. But he was a weak one. He was a man who had been raised to believe that love was a luxury and duty was everything. He lived his entire life in a gilded cage, and I think, for a while, he wanted to be free. But his mother held the key, and she reminded him how safe the cage was. She told him about the pregnancy, about Beatrice's cold fury, and about the calculated introduction of Serafina. She was honest about the pain, the loneliness, the feeling of being discarded. He was given a choice, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. A choice between a real, complicated life with us and a powerful, simple future his mother had designed for him. He chose the one that required the least courage. She finished not with the scene of her abandonment, but with her arrival in Seacliff. He closed a door on me that day, she told Julian, her eyes meeting his. But in doing so, he unknowingly opened a window for us. He set us free. Everything we have, this bakery, this home, this life, we built it. You and me. It's real, and it's ours. In a way that nothing in that mansion ever was. She had given him the facts, but she had framed them in a narrative of strength, not of loss. Her story was not what was taken from us, but what we built for ourselves. Julian listened, his expression unreadable, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't speak for a long time after she finished, the only sound the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Ilara's heart ached, fearing she had burdened him, that she had replaced the simple peace of his childhood with the heavy knowledge of his father's betrayal. But then, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. His hand was large, steady. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You are all the family I will ever need." He stood up, collected their plates, and began to wash the dishes. The topic closed. He asked for no more details. He showed no outward anger. He simply absorbed the truth. But later that night, a different story was unfolding in the glow of a computer screen. In the privacy of his room, Julian sat at his desk, the family tree assignment lying forgotten beside him. His fingers moved with practiced speed across the keyboard. He was not looking for old family photos or birth records. He was pulling up financial statements, news archives, stock market analyses. On the screen was a web of information, a complex digital portrait of Sterling Corporation. He read about their leveraged expansions, their mounting corporate debt, the whispers of instability in financial forums. His face was a mask of concentration, his mind connecting dots, seeing patterns. The boy who had asked the questions was gone. In his place was a young man, methodically, dispassionately, and silently beginning his own search for answers. A quiet, personal reckoning had just begun. While Julian was quietly assembling the story of his past from the digital breadcrumbs of the present, the subjects of his investigation were living in a world that was beginning to fracture under its own immense weight. An empire built on high-risk gambles and cold-blooded ambition is a fragile thing. It requires a steady hand, a market that endlessly forgives, and a will of iron to hold it all together. For the Sterling Corporation, all three were beginning to fail at once. The unraveling began not with a crash, but with a tremor. The aggressive expansion that had graced magazine covers was, in reality, a mountain of leveraged debt. Liam, mimicking the ruthlessness of his mother without her cunning, had purchased vast, speculative properties at the peak of the market. When a mild, then moderate, recession hit, the value of those assets plummeted, leaving the company exposed and gasping for air. The tenants for their luxury high-rises never materialized. The ambitious international projects stalled, bleeding money day by day. The Sterling name, once a synonym for stability, was now whispered in financial circles with a nervous, predatory curiosity. The true earthquake, however, was biological. Beatrice Sterling, the unwavering, formidable matriarch who had steered the family through every storm for 50 years, suffered a massive stroke. It did not kill her, but it did something worse. It silenced her. The mind that had orchestrated mergers and dismantled rivals was now trapped inside a still, unresponsive body, her sharp, calculating eyes now vacant. With Beatrice's sudden, silent abdication, Liam was truly alone at the helm for the first time in his life. And the weight of the crown was crushing. He was a puppet who had not just lost his strings, but the very hand that gave him motion. His attempts to project strength were transparently desperate. He made rash decisions, fired loyal, long-serving executives who questioned him, and poured good money after bad, all in a frantic attempt to maintain the illusion of control. The first person to see the ship was sinking was his co-captain. The marriage between Liam and Serafina, a contract forged in ambition, was not designed to weather this kind of storm. Their sprawling, minimalist penthouse, once a stage for their power couple performance, became a battlefield of bitter, whispered arguments. There was no comfort, no solidarity, only the cold calculus of self-preservation. "My father is asking questions, Liam." Serafina's voice would cut through the tense silence of their dinner table. "He wants to know why the Vance name is attached to your failing projects. This is not what I signed up for." Liam, haggard and defensive, would retort with hollow bravado. "It's a temporary downturn. The sterling name always recovers." Serafina would laugh, a sharp, humorless sound. "You're not the sterling name, Liam. You are just the man who inherited it. Your mother was the name, and she's gone." The end of their alliance was as swift and unsentimental as its beginning. One morning, Liam woke up to find Serafina's half of the vast closet completely empty. On his side of the bed lay a single sheet of paper from her lawyers, informing him that she had filed for divorce and that her family was formally initiating proceedings to disentangle their assets from the failing Sterling Corporation. She didn't even say goodbye. She simply excised him from her life. A bad investment to be written off. He was left alone, surrounded by acres of white marble and glass, a king in an empty, echoing castle. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, in the small town of Seacliff, a different kind of dynasty was flourishing. As the Sterling Empire cracked, the rising loaf expanded. Alara had leased the shop next door, knocking down a wall to create a bright, airy cafe space with a patio that was always full on sunny days. Her success was slow, steady, and built on something tangible: the loyalty of a community and the quality of her work. The contrast was stark, a silent commentary playing out across a continent. In Boston, a son was losing an empire he had been given. In Oregon, a mother was building one she had earned. On the day Liam received the divorce papers that would cost him a fortune, Julian, now 17, stood on a small stage in his high school gymnasium, delivering the valedictorian address, speaking about the power of building a future from the ground up. Alara sat in the audience, her face a portrait of quiet, unadulterated pride. Liam's descent accelerated. Stripped of his mother's guidance and his wife's strategic partnership, he was in a free fall. The creditors began to circle, then to close in. The company was forced into a painful public restructuring. They sold off assets for pennies on the dollar. The media, which had once fawned over him, now documented his every failure with savage glee, publishing articles with headlines like "The Sterling Silver Tarnishes" and "How an Heir Lost an Empire." He retreated to the old family mansion, the very house he had thrown Alara out of all those years ago. He wandered its silent, cavernous rooms, a ghost haunted by the echo of his mother's disappointed voice and the crushing reality of his own inadequacy. He had done everything she had asked. He had made the hard choice. He had sacrificed love for legacy, and in the end, he had lost both. The dynasty was in ruins, its foundations rotten, its walls crumbling around him, and he was the sole, pathetic heir to a kingdom of dust. Julian's departure for college was a quiet affair, marked not by a large party, but by a long walk on the beach with his mother the evening before he left. At 18, he was a man, his scholarship to a world-class engineering program, a testament to the brilliant, focused mind he had cultivated in the quiet back rooms of the bakery. Alara looked at her son, his shoulders now broad, his gaze steady and clear, and saw a strength she knew the world could not break. She felt a bittersweet mix of pride and sorrow, the inevitable letting go that is the final, painful, beautiful act of motherhood. She thought he was looking toward his future, at the bright, limitless horizon that awaited him. She was only half right. Before he could build his own future, Julian needed to perform one last, final excavation of the past. In the weeks leading up to his departure, He had transformed his bedroom into a silent, nocturnal command center. Long after his mother was asleep, the glow of his monitors would cast long shadows on the walls. This was not the aimless web surfing of a teenager. This was a methodical, forensic investigation. His search began where the story did. Boston, 18 years ago. He started not with financial records, but with the ephemeral, gossipy archives of the city's high society. He sifted through digital microfiche of old newspapers, defunct blogs, and society photo galleries. He was a digital ghost, walking through the parties and galas of a world he never knew. And there, he found the first threads. He saw photos of his mother, radiant and smiling beside Liam at a charity event, only to disappear completely from the record a month later. In her place, suddenly, was Serafina Vance, her face a constant, calculated presence at Liam's side, with Beatrice Sterling always hovering nearby, a satisfied shepherdess with her prize sheep. The timeline was damning. With the social narrative established, he moved on to the architecture that supported it, the money. His technical skills allowed him to navigate the labyrinth of public corporate archives with an ease that would have taken a financial analyst weeks. He pulled the annual reports for Sterling Corporation and Vance Industries from the year of his parents' separation. There, buried in the dense, jargon-filled appendices of a merger proposal, he found it. The language was sterile, speaking of synergies, strategic alignments, and the unification of key familial interests. It was a marriage contract written in the language of a corporate takeover. The merger was contingent upon a joining of the families, a promise of stability and continuity that could only mean one thing. His mother hadn't just been replaced, she had been a casualty of a hostile merger. The most chilling discovery, however, came from the dark, forgotten corners of the internet. On a message board for ex-employees of Fortune 500 companies, a forum for airing grievances and sharing secrets, he found a long, anonymous post from over a decade ago. The user, claiming to be a former executive assistant at Sterling Corp., wrote a bitter tirade about the tyrannical reign of Beatrice Sterling. And in the middle of the post was a paragraph that made Julian's blood run cold. The worst, the user wrote, was how she handled her own son. He was married to a lovely girl, an artist, but she wasn't from the right family. When the Vance deal came along, Beatrice didn't hesitate. She orchestrated a complete removal. We were tasked with drafting memos on the realignment of Mr. Sterling's personal assets and liabilities. That's what they called his wife, a liability. They paid her off and erased her like she never existed, all to close a deal. A liability. The word hung in the air of his silent room. His mother, the woman who had built a life from nothing, who had loved him with the force of a supernova, had been reduced to an accounting term on a corporate memo. The search was no longer academic. It was personal. He had the what and the why. Now, he needed the where. He began to track the fall of the empire, following the digital trail of foreclosures, bankruptcy filings, and liquidation sales. The Sterling mansion had been sold to a foreign investment firm. The penthouse was owned by the bank. Liam Sterling, the man, had seemingly vanished. But people never truly vanish in a digital world. There are always breadcrumbs. Julian cross-referenced public records, voter registrations, and utility transfers. Finally, he found him. Liam wasn't living in a penthouse or a mansion. His current address was a unit in a decaying low-rise apartment complex in Revere, a gritty suburb north of Boston, a place where empires went to die. Julian leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating a face that was perfectly calm, perfectly still. He felt no surge of hot, vengeful anger. Instead, a profound and chilling clarity settled over him. He saw it all. The weakness of his father, the sociopathic ambition of his grandmother, the cold, transactional nature of the world they inhabited. They were not titans. They were just flawed, cruel people who had built a house of cards and were now shivering in the ruins. He had all the pieces. He understood the strategy, the execution, and the pathetic aftermath. The knowledge was a weight, but it was also a shield. He would not use it to confront them, not yet. He would hold it, he would go to college. He would build his own life, his own strength, on his own terms. But he now possessed the complete, unvarnished truth. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that a day of reckoning would eventually come. He was no longer a boy searching for a father. He was a man who had audited the books of his own history, and he had found the culprits. An empire does not vanish without a trace. It leaves behind ghosts, debts, and broken men. Liam Sterling, now in his early 40s, was all three. He lived in a small third-floor apartment in Revere, a place that smelled of damp regret and stale coffee. The panoramic windows of his past had been replaced by a single, grimy pane of glass that looked out onto a crumbling brick wall. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by worn, ill-fitting clothes. The man who once commanded boardrooms now spent his days nursing a cheap coffee in a local diner, a ghost at a feast of mediocrity. The last of Serafina's divorce settlement was dwindling, and the vast, empty expanse of his future terrified him more than any market crash. In the long, silent hours of the night, when the loneliness was a physical weight, his mind began to drift backward. Not to the glittering galas or the cold embrace of his mother, but to a memory he had spent nearly 2 decades diligently suppressing. A girl with paint on her fingers, a rainy afternoon, a door closing. It was not a memory of love, but of an untied thread, a path not taken. He began to construct a fantasy, a desperate narrative of what might have been. He imagined a simple woman, a struggling single mother who would surely have a well of pity for him. He imagined a son, a boy who must have wondered about his powerful, important father. In his pathetic delusion, he saw them not as people he had wronged, but as a potential resource, a sanctuary, a lifeline. He wasn't seeking to atone for his sins. He was looking for a place to hide from their consequences. Fueled by this last, desperate sliver of hope, he sold the few remaining possessions of value, a set of antique cufflinks, his father's watch, and bought a cross-country bus ticket. The journey was a slow, grinding humiliation. He, Liam Sterling, who had once flown private jets to Monaco, now sat with his knees crammed against the seat in front of him, staring out at an America he had only ever seen from 30,000 feet. It was a landscape of truck stops, forgotten towns, and weary faces. For 3 days, he was nobody, just another passenger in the great, anonymous river of American life, and the stripping away of his identity left him raw and exposed. When he finally stepped off the bus in Seacliff, Oregon, the air itself was a shock. It was clean and sharp with the smell of salt and pine. The town was a picture postcard of a life he couldn't comprehend. Tidy storefronts, cheerful-looking people who nodded as he passed, a sense of community that felt entirely alien. He asked a woman watering flowers outside a bookstore for directions to a cafe called The Rising Loaf. The woman's face lit up. "Oh, Alara's place. It's the heart of the town. Just down the street. Best sourdough on the West Coast. Alara's place. The heart of the town." A cold knot of apprehension began to form in Liam's stomach. This was not the narrative he had written for her. He saw the bakery before he reached it. It was beautiful, with a warm yellow facade and large, clean windows. It was bustling with customers, their laughter spilling out onto the street. He stood across the road for a long time, a shabby ghost in a vibrant painting, and then he saw her. She was behind the counter, laughing with a customer, her hair tied back, a dusting of flour on her cheek. She wasn't older, she was timeless. The fragility he remembered was gone, replaced by a calm, radiant confidence. She moved with the easy grace of a woman who was master of her own domain. This was not the broken, weeping girl he had left in a silent mansion. This was a queen in her own, self-made kingdom. His courage almost failed him. His fantasy of the downtrodden woman who would welcome him with pity and forgiveness evaporated in the bright Oregon sunshine. But desperation is a powerful motivator. He straightened his worn jacket, took a deep breath, and walked across the street. The small bell above the door chimed as he entered, a sound that seemed to make every head in the busy cafe turn. Ilera looked up from the cash register, a polite, professional smile on her face, a smile that froze and then dissolved as her eyes met his. Time stopped. The warmth in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a look of profound, utter shock, as if she were seeing a specter from a long-buried nightmare. The murmuring of the cafe faded into a deafening silence. Liam walked forward, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the wooden floor. He stopped at the counter, the smell of fresh bread and coffee making him feel dizzy. "Elara?" he said, his voice a dry, cracking sound he barely recognized. "It's me, Liam." She said nothing. She simply stared, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the counter. He began to speak, the words he had rehearsed on the long bus ride, tumbling out in a pathetic, desperate torrent. I know I have no right, but I had to find you. I was a fool, Elara, a coward. My mother, she controlled everything. I was too weak to stand up to her." He blamed Beatrice. He blamed Serafina. That marriage was a sham, a business deal. It was never real. He blamed the market, the economy, the world. "I lost everything," he whispered, trying to summon tears that would not come. "The company, the money, all of it. It's all gone." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, pleading tone. "For 18 years, I have thought about you, about the child, my son." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. "I know I don't deserve it, but I am begging you. Let me apologize. Let me just see him. Once, please, Elara. I have nothing left." He had laid his entire, wretched soul bare on her counter, a final, desperate gamble. He waited for her response, for a flicker of the old pity, for a sign of the soft-hearted girl he had once known. But the woman who stood before him was a stranger, her face a mask of stone, her eyes holding the cold, silent judgment of 2 decades of pain. The bell above the door was silent. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The silence in the rising loaf was thick and heavy, a palpable thing that seemed to absorb all the warmth and life from the room. The few remaining customers averted their eyes, caught in the crossfire of a war that had started 2 decades ago and 1,000 miles away. Liam stood before Elara, a beggar in a worn jacket, his desperate plea hanging in the air between them. Elara's face was a pale, unreadable mask, but her eyes, those same blue eyes she had passed on to her son, held a universe of old pain, now frozen into a hard, protective sheet of ice. She did not answer him. She did not have to. The decision was no longer hers to make. With a slow, deliberate grace, she turned to her oldest employee, Clara, and said, her voice perfectly level, "Clara, could you please close up for us? I'm so sorry for the disruption, everyone." Then, she picked up the phone behind the counter, her gaze never leaving Liam's pathetic, hopeful face. She dialed a single number. "Julian," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Can you come to the house, please? There's someone here. Someone you should meet." She hung up. Her message to Liam was unspoken but clear. This judgment would not happen here. Not in the sanctuary she had built. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. "We will speak at the house," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The walk was only 2 blocks, but it felt like an eternity. Elara walked a few paces ahead, her back straight, never looking back. Liam trailed behind her like a stray dog, his hope curdling into a nauseous dread. This was not going according to his script. He had expected tears, recriminations, perhaps even a grudging pity. He had not expected this cold, regal control. Their house was small and charming, with a garden full of wild flowers. It radiated a warmth and authenticity that felt like a personal rebuke to his entire life. She led him into a living room filled with books and art and motioned for him to sit on a simple armchair. She remained standing by the window, a silent, waiting sentinel. Minutes later, the front door opened and Julian walked in. He was home for the summer after his first year of college, and he was no longer the boy Liam had imagined. He was a man, tall and self-possessed, with a calm, intelligent face that seemed to assess and understand everything in an instant. He looked at the shabby, nervous man sitting in the armchair, and his expression showed no surprise, no shock, only a cool, distant recognition. Liam's heart sank. This was not the reunion he had fantasized about. He scrambled to his feet, trying to muster some form of paternal dignity. "You must be Julian," he stammered, forcing a watery smile. I'm your father, Liam." He started to repeat his pathetic litany, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "Son, I know I don't deserve this, but I made a terrible mistake. I was young, foolish. I've regretted it every day. I just want a chance to know you, to be a part of your life." Julian let the words hang in the air, then took a step forward. Alara remained by the window, a silent observer. This was her son's stage now. "A part of my life?" Julian's voice was not angry. It was something far more terrifying. It was calm, clear, and clinical. "Let's be clear about who you are. You are Liam Sterling, former CEO of Sterling Corporation, liquidated under Chapter 7 bankruptcy 18 months ago. You currently reside at the Oakwood Arms Apartments in Revere. Your last known employment was a temporary position in sales, which you left 2 months ago." Liam stared, his mouth agape. The color drained from his face. This was not an emotional son. This was an auditor. Julian continued, his voice never rising. "You say you've thought of us. That's a lie. You say your mother controlled you. That's an excuse. I've read the archived shareholder reports from 18 years ago. I've seen the public statements announcing the strategic alignment of the Sterling and Vance families. My mother and I, we weren't a mistake you made. We were a liability, a line item on a balance sheet that you and your mother zeroed out to facilitate a merger." He took another step closer. "You use words like father and son, but the only language you truly understand is that of assets and liabilities. So let me put this in terms you can understand." He gestured around the small, warm room. "You are looking at a life that was built not just without your capital, but in defiance of it. You talk about what you lost. Let me tell you what was gained in your absence. My mother's hands, the ones you see right there, built a business from flour and water and sheer will. They paid for my clothes, my books, my education. Her strength was the only inheritance I ever needed." He looked directly into Liam's terrified eyes. "You aren't here for forgiveness. You're here because you're bankrupt, in every sense of the word. You're a failed state seeking foreign aid. But we are not your bank. We are not your sanctuary. We are the consequences of your choices." He walked to the front door and opened it, letting the late afternoon sun stream in. "Forgiveness is earned, Mr. Sterling. It is not a handout for the desperate. You didn't just leave a woman. You abandoned a family." "My family," he said, turning his head to look at his mother, who was now weeping silent tears of pride, "is right here. And she is all I have ever needed." He turned back to Liam, his face set like stone. "You are not welcome in this home." Utterly defeated, stripped of his lies, his dignity, and his last, pathetic hope, Liam Sterling shuffled past his son and out the door, a ghost banished into the sunlight. Julian watched him go, then closed the door with a soft, final click. The sound was not angry. It was the sound of a book being closed, a debt being settled, a story finding its end. He turned, the cold resolve on his face melting away, and walked to his mother, wrapping his arms around her as she finally let go. Her sobs not of sorrow for the man who had left, but of overwhelming love for the man who had stayed. The soft click of the front door closing was a sound of profound finality. In the quiet living room, the storm had passed. Alara looked at her son, her heart swelling with a love and a pride so immense it left her breathless. He was everything she had ever hoped he would be. Strong, not with the brittle, loud strength of the Sterlings, but with a deep, quiet integrity that was as unshakable as the coastal bedrock. She held him, her tears no longer for the past, but for the beautiful, undeniable truth of the present. They had survived, they had thrived. It was over. "He won't find peace," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she pulled back, wiping her eyes. "Men like that, they don't find peace. They just find new people to blame. But he won't find us again." Julian looked at his mother, his expression softening from the cold judge into the loving son she knew. "No, he won't," he said, his voice calm and certain. "He won't bother us again, Mom. I made sure of it." Alara looked at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "What do you mean, honey? You were so strong. You closed the door on him. That was enough." A strange, sad smile touched Julian's lips. It was enough for us, he clarified. But it wasn't enough for them. The world they built, the name they used as a weapon. Just closing a door isn't how you stop people like that. You have to dismantle the entire house. He led her to the sofa and they sat, the afternoon light streaming in through the window. During my first year at school, he began, I developed a small data compression application. Nothing revolutionary, but it was efficient. A tech startup in Seattle bought it from me. It wasn't a fortune, not by sterling standards. But it was enough. Alara listened, not yet understanding where this was going. When I was researching the company's collapse, Julian continued, I saw that in the bankruptcy proceedings, the corporate debt was being bundled up and sold for pennies on the dollar. It was toxic debt, basically worthless to major investors. But I kept watching it. And when the price hit the absolute bottom, I used the money from my application and, through a shell LLC I created, I bought it, all of it, the controlling interest, anyway. The implication of his words slowly dawned on Alara, a revelation so vast and audacious it seemed to suck the air from the room. She stared at her son, this quiet, brilliant boy she had raised, and saw a strategist she never knew existed. You own their debt? She whispered, the words feeling foreign and unbelievable. I am the primary creditor of the defunct Sterling Corporation, he confirmed, his voice devoid of any triumph. It was a simple statement of fact. When Liam Sterling looks for a loan, a new line of credit, or even tries to build a new business under a new name, the records will show that his past entity's largest outstanding debt is held by a company that I control. He is, financially speaking, a ghost. And he will remain one. He paused, seeing the shock in his mother's face. Justice isn't about slamming a door in a broken man's face, Mom. It's about making sure he can never again build a door to lock anyone else out. It's about ending the legacy. He explained that his plan was not to profit from the debt. Instead, he would use his legal position as creditor to force the liquidation of any remaining forgotten Sterling assets, a piece of land, an old patent, a forgotten bank account, and ensure the money went first to the people his family had truly ruined. The employees whose pensions had vanished, the small contractors who were never paid, and once every last cent had been paid to those who deserved it, he would sign the papers to have the Sterling corporate charter permanently dissolved. He was not just closing a door, he was salting the earth of an empire. And so, the story ends. Not with a shout, but with the quiet, methodical keystrokes of a son who had learned the language of his enemies in order to write a more just final chapter. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not breaking, they are forging. Alara's quiet, decades-long endurance had not been an act of passive survival. It was an act of creation. In her silence, she forged a home, a life, and a son with a will of steel and a moral compass truer than any North Star. Her revenge was not in seeing Liam fall. Her revenge was in the simple, beautiful act of raising a good man. The justice that followed was merely the inevitable consequence of that goodness. The Sterling Empire fell not to a market crash or a rival corporation, but to the quiet strength of a mother and the unwavering love of a son. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way forever, and some legacies are meant to be turned to dust and scattered on the wind.